Welcome, everyone. Really good to see you all. I'm Andrew Crosby, and you are in the Regenerative Insights Circle today. This group takes place in the context of the Global Regeneration Co-Lab, and we go in two different modes in this meeting. One is sort of emergent discussion, and the other is a presentation mode. And today we're in presentation mode with Tim Gieseke and Jerry Hatfield. And they've been working on a paper with me at Third Horizon Earth. I asked Tim and Jerry to present a paper and see if we could get some additional insight into what's in it and how it might work. So for those of you who don't know the GRC, come on back anytime. We do this twice a week. Third Horizon Earth is a community-informed and supported tool for regenerative development pioneers. We're just on the verge of launching, so it's going to be later this year, early next year, and we're happy to have you here. So we're going to let Tim and Jerry give a presentation for 20 minutes or so, and then when they're finished, we'll move into interactive mode. The goal is to be building upon each other, building ideas, bringing new ideas in. So something in the lines of appreciative inquiry, if you know what that is, we're looking to build and explore the ideas that they present. So that's it for now. Let me hand it over to Tim and Jerry. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you. I'll just give a brief introduction of who I am, and Jerry can as well, and we'll get into the presentation. So a little history of Jerry and I got in the early 2000s. I came across Jerry's work. I was working in the conservation field, and Jerry worked extensively on environmental indices and saw the value of them. I saw how they transcended the sectors that I worked for, and kind of put some stuff together and shared it with Jerry about 2005. And he kind of gave me the nod that, yeah, this is the right direction. I ended up writing Eco-Commerce 101 in 2009 and 10 and asked Jerry to write the forward. Then over the years, we kind of crossed paths on this. We had very similar missions, but different perspectives on it. And then earlier this year, we connected on this effort in March or so. And so just really been developing and combining our knowledge over the last 6 months, and then worked with Andrew the last couple of months to really help us flesh this out. So this is a 20 years in the working, just like many other people have worked in this field. And we feel like we're poised to put something together and appreciate you being involved with this. Jerry?
Yeah, I'm Jerry Hatfield. I'm a retired USDA Agriculture Research Service Laboratory Director and plant physiologist. As Tim said, my specialty is ag climatology and in the soil plant atmosphere continuum. But I have spent a lot of time looking at water quality, air quality, greenhouse gases, carbon sequestration, all of those different pieces. So, we've been doing a lot of this in a pretty interesting mode. And then when Tim and I started linking up, talking about how does ecosystem services fit with the NCU? And then we just kind of had a marriage of thought, let's put it that way, that we now have geospatial and we have the dynamics of what happens in that geospatial context. So we're looking forward to presenting this to you today and getting your reaction. We're quite excited about this approach because we think it has capabilities of helping us understand ecosystem services and how we begin to really value them in a different perspective. So, Tim, I'll let you have it back. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, it's dynamics of economic systems, ecological systems, governance systems. It's just, a lot there. This is understanding how our planet functions along with human interaction is a complex subject, but the timing is right to pull these pieces together. So I'll start from here and share a little bit about my family history and my current work. Part of it is farming. So I'm the fourth generation on this farm. 140 years ago, my great grandfather started it. From this perspective, we have managed natural capital and profited from producing provisional ecosystem services. And the reason why I use that kind of odd language rather than just the normal language is as we look at regulating, not governance wise, but kind of thermostat wise, ecosystem services, there's a lot of alignment with how all ecosystem services are produced on the landscape. And by siloing them up, I think we have removed a lot of the value or at least added cost to it. So here's our farm as of this summer, rotational grazing system. What I will mention is that cornfield in the back there, we don't operate that, but just to give you a dynamic of agriculture of today, since 2017, that's been farmed by 4 different operators. So the dynamic nature of agriculture is intense. Farming is not like the game of Monopoly. It's like the game of risk. Who's willing to put their resources on the line to capture that value, to take the gamble of sorts to produce that crop? And so as I compete, we're all competing on this landscape. As I compete on there, how does a perennial forage-based system compete? Well, the way I've seen this from 1996, I began farming. In the early 2000s, when these markets started emerging, I recognized that there has to be an efficient way for value to be returned to the landowner and land, just like it is when they produce crops. And so so the next generation, and we do have 3 boys here, none of them are parked on the farm yet, but they're the 5th generation. And, the next generation is going to need new production and economic protocols, new microeconomics to profit from producing these regulating ecosystem service, carbon sequestration, water cleansing, et cetera. So that's kind of the dynamics we have, and I think at the threshold where we're at today. And then what I'll mention is as it goes through these slides, I'll stop at the end of each slide if anyone has any clarifying questions, because some of these slides have some significant information to them. This natural capital unit. Okay, so what would be the attributes of a commons denominator? And that's, of course, a play on words, but it fits well. So a natural capital unit is a geospatial bushel basket that creates physicality for intangible ecosystem services. So carbon sequestration, of course, is a very intangible, water quality can be. And so they're difficult to trade. Corn has a physicality to it that makes it easy to trade. So the NCU provides some physicality that allows it to be more tangible and more tradable. The NCU would initiate a new type of microeconomics. One is based on common values residing on a common ledger. So as I produce carbon sequestration, some other entity wants perhaps credit for that, let's say, to meet their sustainability goals. That's a different dynamic than with corn, when it's basically a private good that gets removed from the farm. Obviously, carbon has to stay on the farm to make it healthier. The NCU functions as an irreducible unit of value on a multi-sided business platform, and I'll get to that term in a little bit here, but basically the unit should stand on its own and be aggregated from there. And then the natural capital unit should support a landowner-centric accounting system, and that shifts and Uberizes the market structure into buyers, sellers, into a professional network. So landowner-centric, it sounds like a nice thing for farmers, which it is, but it really becomes essential to change the market structure rather than myself engaging in 10 different accounting systems with 10 different entities that all want to purchase carbon. There's a lot of sunk costs involved there on my end, on the producer's end. And so to shift that to a centric accounting system is what a common denominator should do. I'll move on from this one because I think the next slide gets more in depth on these topics. So what does it mean to Uberize an ecosystem service market? It's just crazy that 15 years ago, we couldn't imagine some of these new models, business models, multi-sided platforms, but they are the largest, most wealthy, or the most highly valued industries in the world now. So what did Uber do that was so innovative? Well, there was taxi companies that had cars, and when they got a call for a ride, they would dispatch their cars. The rider was responsible for hailing and payment. So that was the model. And in fact, it worked so well that in 2014, the taxi medallions or certificates to operate were around $700,000 a piece. A lot of value in controlling that market. What Uber did with their platform was remove dispatch from cars. So cars now became a commodity on themselves. They weren't tied to any dispatch. So the rider could dispatch and hail and do a payment. When cars were broke off from the taxi dispatching, the medallions went from $700,000 to $40,000. So there's the value of controlling the car dispatch. So Uber created a rider-centric platform to give riders the means to dispatch, hail, and pay. Just as a couple days ago, I checked it, there's about 2 billion shares, $25 a share. So a $50 billion company that shifted because riders now have this centralized way to manage it. So the same thing happened with Airbnb. They created a guest-centric platform to give guests the means for reservations to check in and out. So they broke off the rooms. You could find a room anywhere. You didn't have to have it attached to the reservation. Again, a very profitable enterprise by opening up that ecosystem. Here is a quote from 2014. Marriott wants to add 30,000 rooms this year. Airbnb will do that in the next 2 weeks. So, this is a business model that didn't exist previously. It's 26 times the growth. And you can see the costs involved would be extremely different. Obviously, if 30,000 rooms to be built by Marriott is an expense, Airbnb could add that 30,000 rooms in really at a costless rate. So those are the opportunities that exist, and all the multi-sided platforms use this model. And it's just an incredible shift in business ecosystems. So what do we want to accomplish with this? Right now, corporations, government, whoever it may be, they have a metric and they have an accounting system. And as a landowner, I have to engage in their accounting system and their metric. And again, there's sunk costs there. So with the NCU platform, we break off the accounting system from the metric. And then the landowner can manage, account for, and receive payment for ecosystem services without having to deal with each accounting system but their own. And, it's kind of odd to put a price on a functioning planet, but the ecosystem services that the natural capital provides are from $5 to $100 trillion. The idea is there's a lot of unaccounted for value. And one more statement I'll make is Uber and Airbnb and all the others captured underutilized assets. So a car sitting on a street is an asset underutilized, and a room sitting vacant is an asset underutilized. So the platform allowed those unaccounted for assets to be brought into the economy. And so with natural capital and ecosystem services, that's where we're at. Yes, Ned?
Maybe you're going to get into this, but you talked about valuing the activity or the impact of the activity. Are you envisioning setting that price based on the farmer interest or letting the market set that price?
It's market driven.
Okay. All right.
So now we'll dive a little bit into what this natural capital unit is. Analogies are helpful. So kind of looked at it as the bushel basket, and the bushel basket is an economic unit, but it's a production unit. If you can produce something, 50 bushels per acre, that gives you a sense of the productivity. Also, if it's $20 a bushel, it's an economic unit. So it plays both sides of that. And also, what's kind of unique is, you take things for granted after a while. The bushel basket is just really an arbitrary empty bucket that someone decided to institute. About 1760, I believe, is when it was deemed the size it is, although you can imagine how many different variations happened thousands of years before. But so you have a bushel basket. Here's this natural capital column. Again, land productivity ratings is kind of how that natural capital is rated. And then you have an ecosystem services of grain, which is called a provisional ecosystem services, one that we use. So that's really, as a producer, this is my accounting system. Of course, if there's others beside bushel, cords of wood and things like that. But the bushel basket kind of is a good analogy for this. Now, if you go to the natural capital unit, if you can envision it as, again, just an empty container, a cyber physical container is kind of how it could be described. There's multiple natural capital classification systems out there, most designed from the top down. This natural capital classification system, I adopted it or modified it from a gentleman in Norway from 1981, Logba, and he was commissioned to identify natural resources from an economic perspective. So I took his thinking, modified it slightly, and put it to the natural capital unit. So really what we see here is 4 types of natural capital. It's kind of an abiotic sandwich with biotic in between. So abiotic would be the energy flowing into the ecosystem, water and wind and sun. And then the bottom, the abiotic non-renewable, is really the subsoils and the bedrock and minerals and things like that. And then inside the sandwich, you have the biotic, conditionally renewable bioprocesses. Those are the living soil components. And then the biotic, conditionally renewable biophysical resources, and those would be the crops and other things. So the conditionally renewable means the output is based on the conditions of how they're managed. The non-renewable minerals and things are non-renewable. You consume them and they're gone. And then the top, the renewable inflowing, we can't control the rate of sunlight that's constantly coming in. So that's kind of the layers of natural capital that we depend on, that I manage with on the farm and others manage for. This is what we have to work with. So then the ecosystem services that come from those, this is just a very short list, but you can see 3 of them are provisional and 1 is regulating. And provisional are quite easy to measure because they're physical and you use them and you can measure them in a variety of ways. Regulating, which would be, this component is really what this is all about, is how do we create some physicality to the conditionally renewable bioprocesses? And you have to create some work. So much of Jerry's work that I came across was really defining these processes and how we can communicate what these are. And they're very complex and you can't measure them exactly, but how do you move toward it? And then, so this NCU becomes this irreducible unit of value on this platform. Does anyone have any clarifying questions on that and how this is viewed? Yes, Marna.
I heard you say something about minerals being non-renewable, and I just wanted to see if I heard you right, because I know that things like calcium have their own sort of nutrient cycle and perpetuation. So is that like what you're talking about? Different.
Sure. Mainly more like minerals like ores. All those things have a life cycle, of course, but even like hydrocarbons, those are all non-renewable. So anything that has, an extensive renewal process or non-renewable. So from minerals, like a plant productum perspective, yeah, they would have their process. But so the non-renewable geophysical resources are those that are non-renewable. Nothing never changes, but in a lifetime. So if you take this natural capital unit and then populate a platform, that's where we're moving toward. So in this commerce as a services platform, you have landowners, you have the functions of the multi-sided platform, and you have buyers and you have contributors, those that bring professional expertise onto the platform to make it better, faster, cheaper, or organized. So this kind of looks busy, but I think it will work fine. Here's the data layers that you stack up to create this platform. So we start with distributed ledger technology or blockchain. We layer it with these natural capital units. There's GIS Landsat data that can be brought into this. And so that kind of just sits there as a static unit. And then the field parcel mapping would be, the landscape that we operate on. And when I work with my agronomist, I will delineate my fields, and that's kind of what this shows here. So if I look at the yellow inner square, let's say I delineate that field, and then kind of getting a little ahead of myself, but buyers may also delineate areas on the landscape that they have an interest in. And the point here is that we're trying to find interested buyers and sellers. And that's kind of what this NCU does as well. So we have this data layer and accounting system underneath. Then we have this field parcel map where we can identify our interests. And on the left there, you can see when I delineate those natural capital units to my field, I create a geo NFT. So basically just a unique unit of value where I can account for my ecosystem services. Then above that, what would be the best metrics to put on this platform? And so there's lots of metrics to choose from. The platform would have their default metrics because you have to start somewhere. And that in itself could, with the data and the Landsat data, and my delineated field and the default metrics, as you can see to the left, I can create an Ecode Portfolio 1.0. And it says this is not tradable data because the assurance isn't there because the landowner hasn't contributed any assurance. But the analogy again is like June crop reports. So in June, the USDA will come out with their estimated crop field for the year. And sometimes they'll say to the 10th of the bushel, they estimate 170.2 bushels per acre of corn crop this year. And the market responds to that in a way that it recognizes value. In many cases, there's not a kernel on the corn. So what this level is just, if you want to understand some kind of superficial, maybe isn't the right term, but some superficial inventory of how much carbon is produced or water quality is produced, those type of things, or how much corn is being produced. This is kind of the data that is used to produce this first level. So it's at that accounting piece. But again, this is just information. It's not marketable to an extent because the landowner is the one that provides the information to provide assurance. So if I have all this data, I have these metrics, if I put in my land management data, like what I planted, when I planted, how much fertility I applied, fertilizer I applied, what I tilled, what my crop rotation was, all those things now change the dynamics of the outputs. And, and that's where, that data comes in. And then here's where the market intelligence comes in. So what I have learned over the years is that groups get together to identify what they should value and how they should value. Like we should have a water quality index, and it should be that out of 100 scale, it should be 80, and that's water quality. Well, those conversations go well, until really the very end when the whole group has to decide what metric and what value. And we focus so much on getting the metric right today that we kind of are losing the forest for the trees, if I can use that. So we have all this data. We had the land management data. The market should be able to decide what metric to use. We certainly will provide our metrics on the platform, but a specific entity may have a regenerative agriculture metric that they have developed and they want, or a third party may have developed a lot of metrics that they want people to use and try out and be compensated for. So this is the most evolving aspect of ecosystem markets, is the metrics. And sometimes I think we get stifled because we want to stop the evolution of these, because this is really the only playing field we have. So on the left there, you get an Eco Portfolio 2.0. It's the credit or private or club good that resides on the ledger, and that allows people to see what you have available. If you consider those top three layers there, once you have all the data and the land management in place, which really I already do with my agronomist, all you have to do is change out the metrics, because most of these metrics use almost all the identical data. There may be differences a little bit, but basically you use all the same stuff, and how the algorithm it looks at it is the difference. So if you look at it from this bottom layer, is really the kind of the static data that's in existence today. Jerry's working with a group that is really defining how to bring that data to the NCU so that part can become more efficient. And then the top part here is really where the market gets to play. What are the metrics? What are the values? And from eco-commerce as a service perspective, what we want to be able to provide is that bottom piece, and then allow entities decide what they value to what degree. Work on the stuff that they care about. And then the contributors are just these that are allowed, the space in the platform to make it better, to organize things, to be part of that ecosystem. So, Jerry, you want to elaborate on this?
Yeah, just going to elaborate just to touch on it. Marty, you asked a question on what kind of fertilizer in the chat box, and I was curious what your question was.
Thank you. It was less a question and more like a notation in terms of the metrics for calibrating the potential value of what people are up to, because there's a big difference between chemicalized fertilizer that shocks,
Yeah, that was my interpretation of your question, but I wanted to make sure that I understood your comment. If you look at that layer in there called land management data, that's really where the producer becomes very involved, because if you think about this NCU, it is actually a lot of subdivisions within a field. I mean, we're based it on a 1 square meter. I mean, there's a lot of 1 square meters in a field that, a farmer is looking at, and we allow in the metrics to be able to say, all right, so if you go UAN fertilizer to manure, putting that through a metric out there is going to have an entirely different impact if you're putting manure on, because not only you have the nutrients, but you have the carbon that's going back into the soil. You've got a lot of other pieces. You also have to link that with the tillage system that's there. So there's a lot of management options that go into this. And so that's why when we talk about it being a landowner-centric is because we're dependent upon what that landowner is doing to manage that. But in the reverse side, you could come back and say, where are parts of that field that are sequestering carbon more efficiently than others? And where are parts of that field that are causing you water quality problems? And now you can start looking all of these different pieces coming together and utilizing the farmer input data, remote sensing data that's high resolution, all these different pieces that come together. So it's really built to be pretty much of an interactive tool. And an aspect that Tim mentioned back on his original farm in terms of rotational grazing, and how does that management system improve the quality of the forage that he's producing? And what does that mean for the cattle that go onto that rotational grazing spot, and what will be the value there? So we're looking multidimensionally in terms of how all these things begin to link together.
Marta, I think what you're asking and what we're seeking too is, where is the value to manage these systems in a more holistic manner? And so I've crop farmed from 96 to 2017 before we converted over to a rotational grazing system. And believe it or not, I'd never once put anhydrous ammonia down in my soils. I just felt they were destructive, and I had other means to do that. But what are those values ecologically and economic, and how do these metrics on top look at the policies of the government, the policy of corporations? They kind of weave their policies into these metrics to guide me on how they want me to produce food. So that's kind of where we want that communication to occur. How do I, as a producer, understand what is valued, and then how can I shift my production toward those values? Ned, you have a question?
Yeah, it's somewhat related to that. So we're at a time of incredible innovation in all aspects of the way we treat nature, especially in precision farming and things like that. And we have a lot of sort of new science and a lot of unproven innovations that seem to have common sense approaches. So in this layer between land management data and land management policies, right? What policies are you adopting and why? Are you doing anything? And as you know, this is where we're working really between platform default metrics and the top to expose and improve the models people are using when they're considering no-till versus till, or what crop to use for crop switching or whatever, because you might have 5 different models that give you very different results or have preconceived biases in them, and how you resolve those to give somebody clarity, both ex ante and ex post, in terms of, I think this is going to give me these results in terms of my NCU. Did they do it? And how do you get a view on that and constantly proving it in your system? Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and Jerry would probably could respond to that fairly well.
Yeah, and Ned, that's an excellent piece of this. You really have touched on the heart of what we've been talking about, and that is that we get producers to adopt a certain practice. And that's always been one of the things in precision agriculture, is that we figure out what the spatial variation is. We apply a precision dynamic to that. And yet one of the pieces we fall short is saying, did it really achieve the goal that we wanted? And it was a result of the intervention that we put in. And this is when we begin to think about, how do we bring together multiple layers of information that give us not only how that system's performing, but then look and say, did it perform the way we wanted, and what changes need to be made? So part of what we've been working on with producers is adaptive management and continuous improvement, because now you've got a framework that they can begin to see the impact of what decisions they've made and look at self-corrective actions that go through that. So I mean, this is a platform that has a lot of capabilities in terms of being able to draw these pieces together. But it's a matter of, how do we get that producer to realize that we're adding value to their system for whatever changes they've made, or if those were the right changes in their management practice as well. Because sometimes we don't make the right changes. We always think we do, but sometimes, we could do better. And so this platform allows us to begin to do that.
Yeah. So as I think Tim knows, we're building a system very complementary to do exactly that. So happy to try to figure out if we can do something together. But one thing we found that we're going forward with this is, like,
getting out of this compliance-based methodology, which is where we're in right now, right? Compliance is important, but it shouldn't be the objective. Performance should be the objective. So performance-based systems. And then, we do have a challenge in the current markets where they expect everything to be perfect. So they don't even take into account the fact that this innovation might not work or might need a couple iterations to work right, and sort of building that into the process, which means you now change accountabilities on the side for anybody who's buying the carbon benefits or the ecosystem benefits or whatever. They have to recognize that. So I think as a community, it's really important that we start talking about that. Like we have to expect failure. We have to expect unknowns, and we have to be able to adapt to that. I'm not sure the compliance people know how to deal with that, and therefore they don't embrace it.
Economists have to meet ecologists is what we have to do here, because the ecology is not an exact science. Obviously, economics isn't either, but they expect it more so. Rick, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just want to invite you to maybe, if you've not already done so, but to think about different stories or story scenarios about how the model can play out depending on how players use what you're proposing. And our food policy has got much to be desired. And if you were to change the food policy to shift it towards more regenerative farming, how would you enable that to happen? So 2 questions. The first one is, to make this sort of more concrete to people who aren't in the field, stories are a great way of illustrating what the different sort of scenarios might be. And then secondly, if you could have influence over public policy to do the right thing for regenerative farming.
So I, kind of go on Ned's comment. So I've experimented 26 times on our farm since 1996, and each one of them has had a different outcome. And when I started farming, it was a highly intensively managed moldboard plow operation. And so if you would run each one of my years through this, you would get different outputs and you could see the dynamics changing. So that'd be, one storybook there. But then also to your question. So actually, when I came across Jerry's work, the first time I believe was when I was working on farm policy with the Conservation Security Program at the time. It was an outcome-based system. And so I thought, well, this is really neat stuff. Why don't we just say a soil conditioning index of 0.2 is worth $10 an acre? There's your policy, right? And then go forward. But, so I think once you get a platform built that accrues intelligence, then it can inform policy. But we really don't have this language yet. It's kind of like the Tower of Babel, right? There's all this all over the place. We're just looking for a landowner-centric way to bring it together so this conversation is more coherent. Jerry, do you have any comment on food policy since you're steeped in it?
I think that's going to be our big challenge, is to show, and then we won't think about food policy, but thinking about the value of regenerative ag. So what's the value of, again, adopting these practices and leading to higher quality food? Tim can give you a story on his home farm in terms of the rotational grazing and the benefit that the person that has the cattle that are grazing on it in terms of rate of gain and value. And so that producer's begun to see that, yeah, I can feed my cattle out and I'm going to have a higher rate of gain on that. And a story for you is that about 2 weeks ago, I was asked if explaining some of this to producers, saying, you could almost take this and build a dating app for cows, and trying to get cows and people to match to a landscape that would fit their needs. So you just think about it from it's kind of the Uber mentality, and think about it from that perspective. But, there's a lot of the dynamics yet to have to happen on this. Policy is a tough nut to crack, because people who write policy, in my opinion, believe that they're absolutely correct all the time. But policy is just as fraught with variation as is the weather every growing season. So, I think that we can begin to show that as we make these changes, here are outcomes that fit multiple purposes, not only in producing how much corn, but how much it might influence carbon within that soil, how much it might influence water quality, how much it might influence the overall ecosystem in terms of benefits as well. And so think multidimensionally or more ecologically about the system and everything. And that's what we're trying to do, is bring this together in a broader conversation of multiple outcomes, but all starting with the same platform.
I'm just reminded of the book that George Monbiot wrote just recently about Regenerative. And there's a chapter in there about a farmer who's been working on the land for decades. And he talks about his evolution of regenerative farming. And he goes into intricate detail. It's a very captivating story, but that's just one story.
Mhm.
But I think storytelling is so important to try and convey the importance of regenerative farming and agriculture. So you need to have the technical underpinnings right, but you also need to make it understandable so that people can actually digest what's important.
Well, I'm going to get through these last couple slides and then we'll go to the questions. So this would be a little repetitive, but from a farmer's perspective. So we have that landscape data. I put the little cheat sheet on the bottom there, what those layers mean. So the landowner delineates their field, some sustainer entity delineates it. So now, there's a match there, right? And they can decide if they want to continue, like I say, it's kind of similar to a dating app, regional and of interest. So then we have, this empty NCU, we fill it up with this natural capital data. So it's uploaded. It's the static data. It's available. Part of our effort here is to get that more organized and easily accessible. Then the landowner gets to choose which data sets they want to use. So how do you pick the data that you want? The landowner imports their data and they calculate ecosystem service outputs. And that could even be, bushels per acre, in June. How many do we expect to get? Here's NFT, the eco portfolio. There's eco units in it. Now as a landowner, I get to decide which ones I share, which ones I sell. I'm not going to sell my corn yet. I might, the carbon. So really it's this eco portfolio that I have control over, that I can share, much like when you're a rider or a guest on Uber and Airbnb, you get to decide where your connection goes to. So landowner has control over which eco units are included in their eco portfolio, who has access to the data. So we are not filling that NCU up with specific values. I mean, we do have those platform metrics, but basically we're not going to take that option away. We don't, I'm not going to be able to tell you what the value of things are. That's an idea that each individual has within means. So we refer to vertical and horizontal accounting. So vertical accounting is really how do those layers interact with each other? They're interdependent. If I change one, I might change the other. But then this horizontal accounting is basically how I relate to the markets. If there's a carbon market, I'm just going to give them my carbon data because that's what they're procuring. The other data is there for, maybe auditing or also for other markets. And then, so here's where I think this landowner-centric thing, there's lots of value to it. But again, I mentioned this because when I was first starting this in the early 2000s and I saw all these markets, I said, I don't want 10 doors of opportunity worth $1 each. I want one door worth $10 because every time you open a door, it costs money. So every time I would engage in a market, I'd sink costs into their accounting system and I could not use that value anymore. I think it really comes down to just an economic piece. We need a common unit that people can use. Otherwise, the value gets spread so wide that it doesn't add up. Now, this next slide there's a lot here, and maybe I don't need to do it. It's a kind of a neat look at where I fit in, the farm fits into this mix system that I see has unfolded. I'll go through this quickly. It's not that important, but I'd like to share it because it kind of shows where this value might be. If you go back to our farm, there's the first generation, second generation, third generation, and fourth generation. So I started, between my dad and I, the third industrial revolution started. We started digitizing the world and started changing agriculture. If you go way back, you think of the hunters and gatherers, they started domesticating animals and plants. And to this day, we still have hunters and gatherers, right? That part didn't go away, and so agriculture ecosystems is part of the economy. As this evolution of our economy has occurred, we got the bushel basket in the 1760s. It changes how the opportunities that we have. Now, if you look at the eco-commerce ecosystems, they created Uber, Airbnb, Craigslist, Amazon, and Facebook. So an entire new economic model emerged from digitizing and platforms. It didn't knock any of the other ones away. It just became a prominent new value. So here's where I see where we are at now. We have this GIS, spatial IT, blockchain, crypto world, that all these protocols are now coming together that provide us with the opportunity to do what Uber did, but on a geospatial intelligent manner. And if we can add the NCU in the year 2023, that can bring this forward. We can have another economic avenue, this value that isn't in place yet. So that's the big stuff. I don't want to spend time on it because we're almost out of time, but that's how I see these big protocols, production, these things that are going on in our economy affect. So yeah, what are those models? Utility-based, food-based, watershed-based, like Ned's work in that space there, and who's going to capitalize on this new geospatial accounting system. So summary, I won't really read that over, but I'll go to the next steps. We want to continue to bring this forward to enhance landscape productivity, ESG information, ecosystem service markets. We want to work with technology partners to build out this Web3 blockchain and cryptography architecture. We want to identify pilots and first customer initiatives. Then we want to raise funds, discuss business structures and grant opportunities with funders and users. So, that's kind of where we're at. We're bringing these pieces together, and we're just happy to be able to share that and see if there's interest there. So with that, Andrew, I'll hand it over to you.
All righty. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jerry. Awesome. I was just going to bring up that piece on regulation. You can imagine that if you start seeing the kind of dynamics that you're talking about, that the regulatory response will also need to change in nature. So it's a really dynamic thing. Let's go to Russell and then Ned. We'll take a couple at a time and you can respond then. Go ahead, Russell.
When you talked about on the farm going through all these different accounting systems, it's, in my words, the tool user going to the tool maker's accounting system to make their tool work. And it's the wrong dynamics, if you ask me. And I can understand the wasted time, space, and resources you went through each time. In another context, showing that relationship, much can be said about conventional seed corn companies, fertilizer companies, and et cetera, where the current model has the farmer going to the provider to use the provider's administrative system. So as an administrative system, with this system I'm looking at here today, are you prepared or can you speak? And if I'm crossing the lines, please, I got no social graces whatsoever, as Jerry Hatfield will know because he's talked to me before. Hi, Jerry.
Hi there.
Is there any lock-in to this data set if a user from anywhere comes into the NCU environment?
Multi-sided platforms and Web3, it's kind of like you can put your guidelines up in your rules. People can exit entrance onto these things as costs provide. So the $8 trillion that I threw out there, that value needs to go to the landscape. If we want to see any change, like the value for corn has to go to the landscape if you want to see more productivity. So it's how do you get money to the landowner to produce the values that society says they want? It's really a concept that brought me to this point. We're trying to create an open marketplace on values that are trying to be valued, but it's such a chaotic mess. The transaction costs are high and multiple. No market can really handle that situation. So we're trying to be additive on the low value and be subtractive on the high cost. So we demonstrate this out and see where that falls. Ned?
Yeah, just to comment on that, we believe one of the big flaws right now is the rush to lock down data and be proprietary with it. Mostly because most of that data is not that valuable, or it's so speculative that you don't know if it's any good. All this satellite companies with AIs, they're just selling you a signal. You don't know if it's any better than the other guys or worse, right? So I think we have the opportunity here to create a platform on which people can contribute data and actually get more benefit by contributing it than to keeping it proprietary. And then for those that do have really valuable proprietary insights, they can actually differentiate themselves and capture value in the marketplace as long as they continue to add value. But people should be able to come and go. And the reason why Uber and those guys have been successful platforms is because they get more benefit by giving up their data and they're all that than not. And by the way, we need to be careful using them because in the age of expensive capital, they may not be as high performing as we thought. So I think the platform idea is the right way to go, but maybe with a little more fiscal discipline than those guys had. We, like you, it sounds like, don't believe that there's any one metric. The world may converge on one rubric or whatever, but you have to deal openly with metrics. One of the things I'm most afraid of is that we're doing that when the EU is trying to set a standard and Vera's trying to set a standard. Everybody's trying to set a standard. Are you confident in the ability to put the NCU out there is a really good platform that's interoperable with those things until you prove to be either a functional interoperable or a better sort of standard rich for methodology?
Yeah. So, right. I'm all for there's not disruptive technologies, there's accommodating technologies. And the disruption is the second thing that happens. The first thing is the accommodation. So we didn't try to take the taxis down. We just wanted to get a ride cheaper and easier and faster. We were accommodated. So yeah, I think Clayton Christensen kind of focused on the disruption because he was a business guy, but really from an individual perspective, it was an accommodation that moves everything forward. So this has to be landowner-centric and valuable in itself. It has to be able to provide these eco units in a way that landowners can find buyers in a very low cost way. Because I tell farmers, you're not going to get rich selling regulating ecosystem services. I mean, we don't pay for them now. It's not like they're going to pay more per acre than corn. I mean, it's not going to happen. So how do you set up a really low cost inventory way? But maybe it comes down to, my agronomist, all this data is available. I mean, I do all this already, and they spit out ecosystem service values for me already. The thing we're missing is a way for me to have that happen in my control and invite other people in. But all this information that you've seen in front of you today is already happening. It's just not organized. So I just need to be a little more accommodating so I can find markets for people that are demanding things. And maybe some other things is there's for supply chains as well. This can tighten up people's knowledge on supply chains. I'll give you a story from 2010. I was commissioned by the Department of Agriculture to develop a livestock and environmental quality assurance program. So we said, okay, a water quality index of 80 meets regulatory assurance, regulatory meaning the government end. So they wanted to make sure farmers were meeting a water quality goal. Okay, so we did 100 farms. And as we were doing those 100 farms, I got a call from a cheese processor that said, Tim, we're working with some of our producers. Can I have that water quality data for our sustainability goal? Like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then this is when cellulose ethanol was something or becoming something. And the utility company or that processor said, do you have a soil conditioning index and a water quality goal for that as well? I recognize that the same data from that NCU can go to multiple parties. Yeah. And it really has to go to multiple parties, because if I send it only to the government for their water quality assurance, how would the cheese processor ever know if they're sustainable? It has to be interoperable. And I have to be able to open that gate up and close that gate. And there has to be guidelines. I can't sell it to everyone all the time. But yeah, there needs to be that model where I can have an interoperable accounting system. And it's really hard for that to occur by having others create their accounting system and make them interoperable, which is what we're trying to do now.
I feel like for nature-based solutions, especially, we probably should be trying to solve the value chain, supply chain problem before carbon credit problem, because carbon credits are in a way that makes them really hard. And the people who are really going to pay for this stuff, or at least give you economic benefit on the ground, are going to be the buyers of your corn or whatever. And so did you guys win a smart commodities grant, or are you part of a bunch? I would maybe hope.
Well,
No,
we might plug into some, I don't know, but we didn't get there. Yeah.
Maybe we should work together to plug into some. So I'd love to, I'll just stop talking now, but I'd love to have a follow-up with the two of you. Anybody else can join us? So
we went through the process in August to really kind of nail down the cost of an MVP and going. So we're familiar with that. There's different things that have come up since, but yeah, in the realm of cost, to understand this works is pretty minute compared to the amount of money that is being thrown into the markets. So, I mean, it's just a matter of finding the right people to say, this makes sense. I see a path forward. I can see 30 years down the road with this path. I can't see 30 years down the road with any other ones I've ever engaged with. So, I mean, we have to just kind of look at that long view here and how do we lay out the next decade and still making this resilient as new values, new ecosystems are produced, and how that dating scenario works for so many things. And I'll just throw one out here quick, because it kind of what threw me off a little bit. Someone said, Tim, you're going to design a platform, but people are going to use them how they want. I'm driving in November a couple of years ago, and there's standing corn stalks in Minnesota to catch snowdrifts. The Department of Transportation pays farmers to leave them up over the winter to reduce accidents and snow removal costs. So there's a value there. There's an ecosystem service value. Well, you could easily see how the Department of Transportation could draw polygons around NCUs, how farmers could see where, if they lie on their farm, they could see what the price they're going to get. All this could even be done remote sensing. So, I mean, you just have this. So all of a sudden, it's not even just ecosystem services, carbon. It's just, how do two entities engage with each other on common land use outcomes. And fundamentally, that's really what the NCU does, is make that communication possible. And then we'll give them the tools to negotiate what they want to talk about.
Let me just take a moment here to thank everybody. We can keep going a couple minutes if you want, but I see people are dropping off now. And if you have to be somewhere, please go to it. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Tim and Jerry. Come on back to the Regenerative Insights Circle, and we're going to follow up in the Global Regen Co-Lab if you're part of that, and we'll follow up with people who've registered as well. So you'll have access to the video and so on. So let me close officially with that. And whoever needs to leave can leave, and we can keep going on the Q&A for a little while if anyone wants. I see Marna's got her hand up.
Thank you. I'm just curious if there's a way to incorporate value awareness, or there's something about like the decentralized value of the regenerative approach, right? Using nutrients and fertilizer and so forth. That value continues on into like the customer wellness cycle. You know, my background as a health coach, that's part of what brought me into the space of permaculture and agriculture and regenerative everything, is the awareness that the health cycle is at stake for the people. And so you start measuring the wellness of the people and the customers as part of the value of chain of choices that happens. And I feel like that could be really interesting. And then there's also an element here of they're starting to sort of measure and value ties around they're calling positive peace. So the opportunity to create the context of peace, not just as in a lack of violence, but like leading toward valuetizing, you know, the kind of place that makes it easier for peace to propagate. And there's a growing awareness about how important that is. So I'm just curious if there's possibilities for growth and commingling around these ideas. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Yes. One of the great things about sharing this is someone always explains to me maybe how it could be used somewhere else, someplace else. I talked to this group in Albuquerque. I think it's called, I forget what the exact name, like Food for Free or something. And they basically mapped all the fruit trees in Albuquerque, and people can pick them, and people can say this is open to the public to pick. And so you just start deciding how this geospatial system can assist in what your goals are. But more to your question, I am talking with people that do very, highly nutrient dense foods. And that is basically the health of the land goes to the health of the food, goes to the health of the people. Now that you have an NCU, there's just one more opportunity to account for that. Life cycle analysis to me begins at the NCU. So many times I see life cycle analysis begin at the thing that comes off the land. Here's a bushel of corn. How does that process through? Well, really, life cycle analysis really needs to begin at the NCU. That has to be part of it. And then where does it go in? We've gotten this far in our civilization without accounting for natural capital in any coherent way. How do we get to where we want to go without accounting for it? That's going to be the trickier one. So we're at the threshold of figuring this out. There's a lot of momentum here. What parts of natural capital do we want to carry forward into our food system and into our health? And that's possible. One other company we talked to has a tracing system that they can identify where they catch the lobster and track that all the way to the plate at the restaurant. Okay. And was it refrigerated in the transit and all these things? Well, you could easily take that UPC code and touch it to an NCU. So now you have that too. There's just a lot of opportunities once you have a geospatial accounting system.
I think they call that now the spatial web.
Exactly. And I can go back and grab my book from Gabriel Rene and Don Mapes, right? I think they wrote that book several years ago. And that is all those pieces. What we're providing in that piece is this ecological unit that has natural capital layers in it.
Well, those guys have created a very proprietary effort, which is not so fun to work with. I can only tell you.
I've read their stuff, but I haven't connected with them.
So any other questions from anyone else? And I can see some offline conversations happening as well up in the future. Thank you. Awesome presentation. Anyone here who hasn't read the paper, please do. It's worthwhile reading, I think, or get in touch with Tim directly. And I'm sure that we'll be in touch with people. So Tim, Thanks for putting the work into it and explaining your ideas. And thanks to everyone else who came and engaged and helped think about it and move it forward. We'll look forward to having another meeting as you move ahead.
Yeah.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody.